Please begin returning to your seats, returning to your computer workstations, your iPads, and I hope for those who are sitting on the beach in San Diego watching this webinar, snap a picture, send it to us, and send it over to our Twitter account. We'll post it here, I promise. Well, good afternoon. We are on the home stretch. And I'm very pleased that we can offer his presentation this afternoon. I have to tell you, on the afternoon of the second day, my mind goes blank. It's managing the insider threat and real-time monitoring of access patterns to EPHI. This will be a panel moderated by Mac McMillan, who will introduce the other members of the panel, but Mac is co-founder and CEO of Synergistic, Inc., a firm specializing in information security and regulatory compliance in healthcare. We actually refer to him as Sir Mac. He is chair, or he's still chair of the HIMSS Privacy and Security Task Force. He is a HIMSS Fellow and brings over 30 years of experience from both government and private sector positions. He's been a wonderful voice for the private sector and in identifying compliance issues and assisting in identifying compliance solutions through his volunteer work with HIMSS. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mac.
Thank you, David. Okay. Well, this audience is like a hairline. The longer the day goes, the more it recedes to the back. So we're gonna try to close it out here with some interesting discussions. So I'm very fortunate today to have three folks that are kind of on the front lines, if you will, in terms of having to deal with this issue. And Mr. Jennings Ask here is from Partners Healthcare. He is the CISO at Partners. And so he's going to be providing the provider perspective when we get into his comments. Michael Terra is from Oracle, and he runs a group of security consultants there at Oracle that actually works on this problem from the solution perspective or the tools perspective, and so he's going to give that perspective for us. And then Daniel Fabry is you're a PhD candidate, correct? No, I'm a doctor. Oh, he's a doctor already. All right, well, all right, so the good doctor is going to give us the computer scientist version of this and hopefully give us the benefit of some of the research that he's been doing at the university with respect to this topic. You know, this is kind of deja vu for me because I think back in 2009, David asked me to speak on the topic of auditing and monitoring for this meeting, and I did. And you know, I think when I look back and I was thinking about that presentation and I was thinking about where we are today, and to be frank, I don't know that we're that much further along today than we were in 2009, unfortunately. When I look at the results of the OCR audits from last year, when you look at the results in terms of how folks performed as it related to auditing and monitoring, we still have a lot of folks out there who are trying to do this in a very manual way and finding out that that's a pretty daunting task, particularly when you look at the numbers of systems, the complexity, the numbers of users we have in our environments today, the number of connections we have, et cetera. It's, you know, you just can't keep track of what's going on in this environment doing it in a manual way. It just really is impossible. And I would hope that soon we'll be able to figure that out and have some good tools to deal with that. I think you had several briefs this afternoon that talked about threat, and they didn't quite do what I was hoping they would do, but But I think in a way, some small way, they heightened everybody's attention to the fact that there is a threat out there, and I do believe that there is one. And when you talk about the insider threat, I was asked this morning, who's susceptible to an insider threat? And it's basically anybody. Anybody's susceptible to an insider threat. You have disgruntled employees. You have employees that are not happy on the job. You have employees who get unhappy at home. You get employees who end up in a financial situation that's difficult. You get somebody who's done something that they shouldn't and who can be potentially blackmailed into providing information to somebody when they wouldn't otherwise. The problem is that people are human. They have foibles, and people that you would never expect will do things that you wouldn't expect them to do. It's a very, and what the problem with the insider, when you think about the inside threat, it's very difficult to track because, number one, you're talking about people who have access, and they have legitimate access. And they have access to a lot of different systems in our environment and a lot of information, right? The second thing that they have is they have knowledge. They have knowledge of what our processes are. In many cases, they know how many times they can do something before the system will alert somebody. They know whether or not we're actually monitoring or not. They know whether we actually have a system out there that's paying attention to them, to what they're doing in the system, and whether or not that's something that generally gets caught in that organization. And because of that, they can do what most insiders do, which is take their time, if they're really interested in stealing information, and take their time and get around those controls and be able to do that, and that's how that all happens. And when you look at some of the examples that we've had recently, where we had the hospital system down in Florida, if you all recall, that had the two admissions clerks who were taking information from children who were coming in car accidents and selling that information to disreputable lawyers who were then using that information to go after those parents to offer them services, right? And the way they were doing it, they weren't violating any of the rules of the hospital system because they knew that the hospital actually had a system in place to monitor their activity. So they weren't printing it. They weren't emailing it anywhere. They were literally looking at the screen and writing it down on a legal pad. And then they would go and sell it. Right? The only way you catch that kind of behavior is when you take your monitoring to a new level and you start looking at behavior and you start looking at pattern analysis. And hopefully that's what our panel is going to talk about. Some of the ways that we can get smarter about how we track what people are doing in our environment. And in fact, in that case, the way those individuals got caught was one of the youngsters who was in a car accident. Her mother was a nurse there at the hospital. They got the call from the lawyer so quickly that she immediately knew that somebody in the hospital had to have alerted the lawyer to what had happened because they hadn't told anybody, and she complained, right? We checked the logs in that particular case because they had the information, they just weren't looking at it. And they didn't have any rules in place that looked at behavior. But what we did was we took the logs in that case and we looked at all of the people involved in the care cycle with respect to that patient. And we looked at their profile, right? And when you looked across all of the folks in different categories, when you got to the folks in admitting, those two admissions clerks had profiles that looked very distinctly different than every other admissions clerk at the hospital. And so they then observed them in real time and caught them in the act of doing what they were doing. And so fortunately the FBI got to come in and put cuffs on those folks and take them away. Just like the acquisition, we had a hospital that we worked with where they were acquiring physician practices, and they were acquiring them so quickly they weren't paying attention to the security around at the actual practice itself. And they were giving the practices access to their EHR as they were very quickly as they were setting them up. One of the administrative people at one of these practices who was shoulder surfing with the physician was pulling information off the screen and selling it for identity theft purposes, right? It took a while to catch that person as well. There's lots of things that go on in our environment that just simple rule-based monitoring is not going to catch. We're going to have to take the game up if we really want to catch some of these people when it comes to things like fraud. And when you look at the fraud, look at the number associated with fraud in healthcare today, which I believe last time I looked at it was somewhere in the neighborhood of around $26 billion. That's an enormous number, an enormous number. And unfortunately, some of those incidents also lead to breaches, which then the healthcare facility has to go through the pain of, if nothing else, just having to clean up the mess, let alone dealing with OCR in an investigation or a review, and God forbid, a resolution agreement at the back end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ask and let him talk about it from a provider perspective, and then we'll go from there.
So good afternoon. Let's see.
There you go.
Great. So first of all, I work at Partners Healthcare. Basically it's a healthcare system founded by the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital in '94. We're an integrated delivery system that we do everything from research to education. We're a teaching affiliate of Harvard Medical School, and we have primary care physicians, community hospitals, basically you name it, and it's part of our system. We have over 50,000 employees, 2,500 licensed beds. We're the largest private sector employer in Massachusetts. And the reason I mention that is because it's actually important to understanding how difficult it is to implementing this proactive monitoring, because we're talking about implementing it in a very large healthcare system and not in kind of a small little tiny community hospital, but in a large system, and that actually poses a lot of challenges. So I'll begin by talking about what we refer to as the LMR, or longitudinal medical record. And this is the EHR that we primarily use in our system. We developed it. It's homegrown. Parts of this are over 20 to 25 years old. And this was certified for meaningful use in 2011, so it meets all of the audit test scripts that you're required to have for meaningful use. So we're very proud of that, and people are testing right now for being meaningful users using this system. Now, as part of the audit capability, we take this very seriously at Partners, the concept of being able to audit, and we actually developed a self-audit utility, and this is something we're pretty proud of, because it lets any individual who's an employee at Partners actually look and see who's looked at their medical record. Now, I'll confess, though, while we're proud of it, my colleagues might be a little mad at me for saying this. I'm not sure how much value this has at this point in time, because I'll confess, I'm a patient of MGH, and I've fired this up and looked at who's looked at my audit record, and I have no idea what it means. I have no way of knowing if these nurses actually should have looked at my record. I guess I could try and investigate that, but I got a day job, so to speak. So, I think for some parts of our organization, this is really valuable. Maybe for some of the clinicians on the floors and things, but for a lot of us, it's actually more noise than it is actual help. So we've also developed an audit utility, and this is part of what we demonstrated for meaningful use conformance when we were certified. This is used by our privacy office staff to respond to patient complaints, and they can log in and see who's looked at a particular patient's record, and it works just like an audit tool should. But as I'll describe, there's actually challenges, I think, going forward with this sort of reactive audit tool. So this is a snapshot of how many patients, or for a single patient, how many folks may look at their record in a particular day. And this is based on research that we've performed. And you'll see anywhere from 15 to 40 folks who will look at an individual patient's record on a particular day. And, interestingly enough, literally researchers might look at a record that same day, because we actually will pull laboratory results into kind of a registry of sorts that researchers query every day. So the entire spectrum of actors in our organization may look at a patient's record. So you multiply that times the number of patients we have, and you're talking about tens of millions of audit events a week. So realistically, when you're looking at that self-audit tool, as you can imagine, it's kind of challenging when just this many folks on one day may look at your record. So I just want to talk about kind of fundamental beliefs. Our system, I think like everyone in this room who works in healthcare, believes that most people who use an EHR, they're using it appropriately. They are just simply there to deliver care, or they're looking at data maybe through a research registry like I mentioned, but they're doing the right thing. People understand this concept of minimum necessary, I think, and our own research bears that out. But as we'll talk about, obviously there's the bad actors out there. Again, other parts of our research, and I'll talk about this a lot. We've done a lot of research into audit patterns, and it really is informing kind of our approach right now. But most EHR access is visit-based, and whether it be outpatient, ED, or inpatient, the providers and support staff and coding and billing. Usually, you can look at a patient coming to a hospital and look at the audit records and see it kind of falls into these categories. Now, lastly, as the last bullet indicates, we expect certain things to happen around visits, and by what that means is, we actually at this point think we have an understanding of anomalous behavior around audit activity. And we're trying to operationalize that, implement some technology to help us with that, and I'll get to that shortly. So just to remind ourselves of what the real-world issues are, the first example is that kind of classic estranged lover who looks at records they shouldn't. The second record is the busy coworkers. There's the nosy neighbors, the third example, and then there's the VIP patient and someone looking at their records. We're all aware of these apocryphal stories. And, as Chief Security and Privacy Officer for Partners Healthcare, I'd be, lying if I said that things like this don't happen at my hospitals. I mean, anyone who works in privacy and security knows that your staff sometimes look at records they shouldn't. One institution I worked at, the number one reason people were dismissed was because they were browsing their coworkers' records. So, this is definitely a problem. It's not endemic. Like I said, our research bears out that most folks do the right thing, but we all know that people look at records they shouldn't. So, we had this project, as the first slide indicated, called Monitoring Access Patterns, and that's what I'm going to start talking about now. I'll refer to it as MAP during the presentation. So we had that audit utility I showed you, and the fundamental problem is that it doesn't provide real-time alerts to unauthorized access. It was something that was functional, but it was reactive. And what that means is that basically a patient had to complain, or we had to know that a VIP was at the hospital, and we treat a lot of the local Boston athletes, particularly for rehab purposes, and so we'll do kind of checks. We know, like, Tom Brady or one of the Bruins are at a hospital, but that's reactive, and that's not really helpful given the sheer tens of thousands of audit events that happen over the course of a week. And as the second bullet indicates, it's really a struggle for our limited privacy office staff to kind of run those reactive reports. I mean, they have day jobs. Like a lot of privacy staff, they work in health information services. They have to respond to requests to amend records, all the patient privacy principles that we all have to help with. So these audit tools really don't scale to the volume of audit events that we deal with and a lot of the larger hospital systems deal with. And because of these concerns, ultimately, as the last bullet indicates, we asked ourselves, could we implement automated monitoring similar to how credit card companies or other verticals have implemented this? So we started these research projects where we proposed to management that basically we could monitor ongoing access patterns with near real-time context information to identify potentially unauthorized access patterns. And by context, I mean simply trying to understand, who the actors were involved, where they were physically located, what they were looking at. So it's not just merely a binary of, person X looking at record Y, but trying to understand that person X was affiliated with a certain care unit. They had a certain set of demographic information associated with them, what the patient's context information is as well. And management thought that was a project worth pursuing. So we actually partnered with Siemens Corporation for 2 research projects to develop this capability. And at a high level, we followed this very simple methodology for each of the projects. We basically implemented technology that captured access event data at the time of access. So that means the time that the EHR user actually accessed a particular record. We collected context data about both the EHR user, and the patient near the time of access. And we filed all this in a relational database, trying to connect all this into, through a table structure. And then we utilized data mining to find possible inappropriate access patterns. And I'll talk more about the challenges we had there. But what we really were trying to do is develop kind of actionable reports that we could turn over to privacy office staff that they could investigate. So we were doing this in the course of these research projects. And, what would happen is we'd have a lot of false positives, or there might be even, in fact, some false negatives, and I'll talk more about those as well. And we just kept iterating and going through this over the course of basically like a 3-year process to basically reach some conclusions about how and where we might be able to do this. So in terms of the methodology, one of the real critical things for us to do was to identify variables that linked EHR users with patients and inferring the reason for the access. And one thing missing from this bullet is actually inferring a positive reason for the user's access. Because we have, like I said, 10 million audit events happening a week, and you're just thinking in terms of having a kind of audit subsystem to process that. If you just throw that sheer volume, over the course of a week, over a month, over a year, you're just compiling all these audit events, and it's really not helpful. You've got to kind of parse that down in some way. So after a certain period, we realized there were variables that if they somehow appeared in a particular audit transaction, if you will, and the context information, we knew we could basically assume that those audit events didn't need to be investigated further. So as an example, a patient has seen a provider previously, or they have been at that clinic, or the people accessing that record were all from the same clinic. Maybe there's some matching among the hospital, or that patient had presented recently. Some combination of those, whatever the secret sauce is, that was what we basically determined. Let's ignore those. Those aren't ones we need to investigate further. But we did identify, variables that basically linked EHR users to patients and suggested there's something that might be suspicious, and that word may or might is very important. And I'll get to a little more explanation in a moment. But, pretty obviously, you might have someone with the same family name and address looking at a patient's record. And from our perspective, that's problematic. Our policies prohibit clinicians from looking at their family members' records without written authorization. Not a basic zip code match, but maybe that combined with, a department. So I mentioned coworkers, right, looking at each other's records. So, maybe the fact that someone's in the same department and they're looking at a record of someone is problematic. All these different things, and I won't go into these in great detail because we do have a panel that I need to leave time for. But long story short, we identified these variables that we felt, okay, with these present, we probably have something worth investigating. We referred to those as scoping variables. So coming out of our research, we've felt the following use cases were the ones that really were high-value targets to try and implement. So first, an employee accessing a VIP patient without consent. Now, I will actually mention, this is actually, while a high-value target, it's really challenging for us because in our hospital system, each one of the hospitals defines VIP differently. It's one of the accidents of the fact that they all were kind of acquired over time and they have existing policies, and we're trying to change that and develop a consistent VIP standard. But needless to say, the concept that someone is, a VIP as we commonly understand it, that seems to make sense and something we're trying to implement. Excessive access by multiple employees of a single patient. And you might notice that seems thematically similar to the VIP scenario. And one thing is that actually a lot of these use cases actually overlap. That the second one that's on the screen, that also may apply to like a coworker who's involved in a shooting, like was one of the real-world examples I mentioned. So there was a nurse who went to a grocery store, was shot by an estranged lover. She was brought back to the hospital she worked at, and all her coworkers were looking at her records. That's an example of excessive access by multiple employees of a single patient. So that also goes into like the coworker use case. So there's a little bit of a blurring of lines of these. The third example, an employee excessively accessing multiple patient records. This is kind of a catch-all, but we basically are trying to set thresholds where just something seems a little off in terms of the number of individuals looking at a record. An employee accessing a neighbor, that's always one of interest. You see a lot of the apocryphal stories in the press about like a nosy neighbor looking at hundreds of neighbors' records, and that's one we're trying to address. An employee accessing coworkers. This is our number one. This is the use case we're most interested in. However, I'll say that this is the hardest one for us to implement, and I'll get to reasons why in a few moments. An employee accessing a patient who's a family member, and an employee accessing decedent records. One thing our research showed us was that basically our staff, outside of research staff, have no reason in general to look at the records of a decedent 1 year after the decedent was last treated. And so that's what our research shows. And as I'll describe, there's always, again, those examples where that's not actually the case. So lessons learned. So we went through these research projects, again, about a 3-year effort. And the first thing I really want to stress is that false positives cannot always be eliminated. Many suspicious access patterns that were investigated actually turned out to be appropriate after investigation. So, first and foremost, employees are patients too. So we have over 50,000 employees. We're the largest private sector employer. So, of course, people are going to our hospitals for treatment. And one good example during our research was there was a nurse who accessed a coworker's record, and then there was no indication of actually doing something. So, of course, we had to investigate. And it was merely a matter of the person forgetting to document they gave a flu shot. Flu shots, someone shows up to a clinic, it's not a big deal. But those are the sorts of real-world problems that go with implementing this sort of proactive monitoring in a large hospital system. And I guess the way to think of it is that, we're trying to proactively address kind of the insider threat and all of these risks that we're talking about. And at the same time, we have limited staff, just like everyone in this room. We can't throw an army at this. We have to try and automate it. But at the end of the day, we're talking about people and imperfection, and there's always going to be these false positives that complicate things. I mentioned decedent patients, so that's the next examples. We had a nurse who was helping out on an investigation as to why a device failed, and so she looked at a record that was associated with a decedent and pulled the information, and it was specific to this one medical device, the IVC filter, gave that to the manufacturer, and that was flagged during the research. An atypical thing, but how do you account for that? Like, where's the system that you can kind of correlate that data into your automated process to say, Nurse X is working on kind of a failed device initiative or something? Those just don't exist. So you're never going to eliminate those sort of false positives. And then, we had an example of a pharmacist doing chart reviews for a drug study and wasn't really following the normal protocol, but it wasn't necessarily inappropriate. I mean, he should have been looking at the data, but those sort of lapses, maybe in terms of paperwork or things, those also will create a lot of false positives. So in terms of the other lessons learned, and I mentioned this I touched on this a moment ago, the EHR is not the only system involved in proactively auditing access patterns. You've got other systems that you kind of have to query as part of the underlying data model to really produce this result. So as an example, your HR systems of record. When you're looking at like the coworkers use case, you've got to have some information about your employment structure, your supervisory structure, where people physically are located to determine if someone in fact is a coworker. Our largest hospital, Massachusetts General Hospital, has over 27,000 workforce members. And people float literally among the different parts of the organization. They may be, a resident moving, around the organization. Determining who's a coworker is a real challenge, and that's assuming like that HR systems are updated. I mean, another example is, let's say you're looking at the family member use case. And let's say the clinician in question who looked at a record just simply failed to update PeopleSoft and say, hey, we just moved recently, or that might lead to a false negative or a false positive. So, when we were doing this research, we had our EHR, but we had all these other systems we had to pull into this database to actually help with the analysis. And, you have all those kind of downstream dependencies that really complicate the analysis, and it's really difficult in a discretionary environment where people don't have to update data on a daily basis or something to make sure that data is always as fresh as you need it to be. And then as I touched on in the last bullet, your EHR system generates millions of audit events a week, so there has to be a means of ruling out specific events before the analysis occurs. So as we've moved on past the research and into kind of trying to make this operational and production environment, we still struggle with the sheer volume of records we have. The first day we ran our pilot, and I'll touch on this in a minute, we had 72 events at one hospital that were, this is our production pilot, 72 events in one hospital that had to be investigated. There's no way a privacy office staff of 5 folks can actually handle that in their day jobs. So it's kind of one of those things where once you start doing this, and we're not going to not do it because of the workload, but it's going to be a really hard workload to operationalize for a host of reasons. So, and this is my last slide. I'll probably talk a little bit about this. So at the conclusion of the research project, we had to determine how to basically implement this MAP technology and how to operationalize it. And interestingly enough, I was approached by Oracle Corporation, and they actually had some fraud prevention platforms they've used in other verticals that they were looking to extend into the healthcare vertical. And we as an organization, we're also making the decision to stop developing EHR technology. We actually are one more organization going forward with the Epic platform. So it didn't really seem to make a lot of sense for us to be developing kind of security technology when there was a COTS solution that we could potentially buy. And we're also transitioning as an organization from a very large software development shop to one that's not. So we decided to partner with Oracle, actually, and we're one of a few academic medical centers implementing this platform. We did some initial piloting last year, and like I said, it was very positive. We learned some additional lessons associated with that. We did, as I mentioned, see 72 events on the first date, and unfortunately, there were half of those were actually false positives, and that just speaks to the difficulty of trying to, I guess, what I'll refer to as tune the engines to help you do this in a scalable manner. So we're actually starting the second phase of this project in June. We're working with Oracle and their integration partner, AppTech, and our plan basically is within the next 6 months to have the majority of those use cases in operations at our hospitals. It's an ambitious plan given the volume of transactions and things, but as we were discussing with Mac and the crew earlier before we started this presentation, we know there's going to be a lot of work that comes out of proactively kind of mining the audit events, but when we do that, we're also going to very proactively let our staff know this is happening, and we're counting on there being a real chilling effect. I think with a few very quote-unquote public examples being made of people, not that we're going to publicize this on like one of our internal intranet sites or something, but word gets around. And I think once some sanctions of some kind come out and people see that we're doing this, I think there will be that chilling effect. We certainly will train all the residents and explain to people this is happening. And again, we're not doing this because we think people are doing the wrong thing. We're doing this because we know that it's the right thing to do for patients. And there are some bad actors out there, but the reality is our own research bears out that most people access an EHR record in the right way. But we do owe it to the patients and our research data subjects to do this. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mike Terra from Oracle, who's one of our partner for this initiative.
So I'll be pretty brief. I only have about 3 slides, but I wanted to introduce you all to the technology that we've been discussing here. The key point that I'd like to make is that being a technology vendor, we try to work with our customers where there are solutions to get them to understand to leverage some of the COTS capabilities that are available and focus on the really challenging problems that will be part of an implementation. And as we heard from Jennings, the real challenging problem here is data. Is the data correct? Do we have the right variables? What is a coworker? How do you define a coworker? I mean, a coworker could be anybody that works in the institution with you. So how do we precisely define that? These are incredibly large challenges. Trying to do that as well as develop the technology is really going to be difficult for an organization to do, especially where there are technologies in the industry that are pretty mature at solving some of these problems. Oracle Adaptive Access Manager is one of those technologies. There's others in the industry as well. I don't want to make this, big Oracle product pitch. There's a company called Fair Warning. RSA does a bunch of this work, so I'll be pretty agnostic up here. There's a number of COTS solutions that you can look at that will provide you with advanced fraud detection capabilities. Many of you have probably already encountered these technologies. If you've ever received a call from your credit card company telling you that you've gassed up 100 miles away from home, just bought a new car, and that you're calling to make sure that you're the right person doing that, that's because there's an advanced fraud engine in the background taking some analysis, running some rules, and then creating an alert and having a customer service agent call you up. If you've logged in from a spouse's computer to your banking site and you're asked to identify that this is your primary device or is this the device that you're logging in from, depending on the bank, you may be using Adaptive Access Manager. So very mature technology that's been used in the financial services industry, let me go back here, for quite some time. And Oracle wanted to take a look at how could we start applying this into different industries. Higher education was another industry that we looked at quite a bit. There were a lot of institutions in higher ed that were going through enormous SSN remediation problems about 2 or 3 years ago, and started to do a lot of PII analysis, trying to see when students were looking at data, if they worked at an IT department, for example, and they were doing password resets. So there's a plethora of different use cases for fraud detection. It really did grow up in financial services. It's been something that's been used in that industry for over 15 years, and now we're starting to see a transition into a number of different industries. I think healthcare is one of the key areas. So we'll offer real-time detection, and the use cases that we're doing at Partners Healthcare are really much on I would say near real-time detection and monitoring and alerting, but the technology can be used to actually do runtime prevention as well. So you could programmatically include this technology as part of one of your platforms and actually stop someone from looking at a patient record, for example. We've, again, seen those use cases in the financial services industry where if you're trying to transfer an amount over a certain threshold from one account to another, that's just going to be stopped right away based on some data elements, and that's the real-time use of one of these fraud prevention technologies. So some of the key elements of technologies like Oracle Adaptive Access Manager are that they provide very advanced risk engines that have a great deal of engineering, research development dollars focusing in on how to do pattern analysis at very, very large volumes. So if we're taking in tens of millions of transactions, how can we effectively churn through that data and get to the right types of decisions that we want to make based on rule sets that we've created? When I talk about fine-grained authorization there on that second point, that is the capability to really incorporate this at a granular level. We're starting to see a lot of use cases where people want to put in data redaction into their applications. So if I'm a certain person in a certain department, and I look up a patient record, I'm going to be able to see the full Social Security number sent back to me. If I'm in a different department and I really don't need that access, perhaps I'll only see the last 4, or I'll just redact the entire Social Security number and mask it completely out. So that really down to the attribute level, data redaction and authorization capabilities are also part of the technology. The fourth bullet there, and looking at the fifth bullet around automated privacy audits, multiple integration options. Those are really the most important for fraud detection and pattern analysis, and what we're doing with Partners Healthcare really isn't about proactive stopping or blocking. There it's really about being able to get near real-time alerting and auditing around some of those core use cases that Jennings had mentioned. So how does it work? There's really 3 main components to really any of these technologies like Adaptive Access Manager. First, we need to be able to acquire the data. So there are data correlation technologies and data correlation engines that are part of the access management platform. We would be able to, for example, look at database transactions or look at a log file or get information on an XML transaction that we're seeing. And we're going to be able to get that information from a variety of different systems and then correlate all of that together. This is one area that's incredibly challenging in healthcare and in higher education. And in a financial services institution, we're probably looking at 1 or 2 core systems, and we're bringing in data from those systems, and typically it's very easy to correlate the different identities across those systems because they're highly regulated, they have been for some time, they have a good sense of unique identifiers, and it's just pretty easy to do. In healthcare, when you're talking about a large hospital system, many little institutions, totally different, maybe medical systems across those campuses, different billing, scheduling, and you need to bring all of that information in and also be able to correlate that Mike Terra in this system is Mike Terra in that system is Mike Terra in that system. It becomes much more challenging. So having a very dedicated analytical engine that can do that multi-affiliation correlation is incredibly important. And that brings me to that second bullet there, correlating all of this data together. So you don't just need rules and patterns to try to alert when something malicious is happening. You also need correlation rules. How are we going to tie all of these different systems together and create a unique identifier for a nurse so that I can know that a nurse looked at a patient record and she doesn't have an appointment with that patient in the scheduling system over the course of the next month and a half, and we want to create an alert on that. That means I really do need to have correlation rules to tie in those different identities from all of those different systems. And then finally, the last part is response. In the case of Partners Healthcare and where we focus mostly in the healthcare industry today, it's really around generating alerts and then allowing a privacy office to come in, take a look at those alerts and try to take some corrective action, investigate it. But as I mentioned, we have the capability to just integrate directly into systems and provide an attribute level, either blocking, tackling, or data redaction if needed. So acquire, correlate, and then provide some type of response. Exactly what we've been doing for several years in other industries. I won't lie, it's much more challenging in the healthcare industry. Jennings spoke to the reasons why, but we think that we have a great platform that would be really a cornerstone for organizations to then go out and build their monitoring and auditing technologies on top of this platform. Let us and let vendors focus on the engine, the rules, the correlation, the core technology, the backbone, and then the institutions that we work with can focus on the use cases, the data, the responses. And with that, turn it over to Daniel.
I think we're moving some slides over real quick here. How's everybody doing today? We're wrapping up? Excited? My name is Daniel Fabry. I'm a researcher at the University of Michigan in the computer science department. So I'm taking a look at this problem from a slightly different direction than maybe we've discussed a little bit earlier in the day. I wanted to start this off with a real quick poll. How many people here in the compliance space do complaint-based auditing for inappropriate access? Would you raise your hand? Okay, so a fair number. How many people are doing proactive real-time auditing right now? So a smaller handful. Okay. So I want to talk today about how the two extremes of these approaches and how we can kind of start to bridge the gap between complaint-based and real-time auditing for electronic medical records. So as reported in the news, so in recent years, we've seen a drastic shift from paper medical records to their digital form. Right? Electronic medical records have the potential to drastically improve patient care by aggregating clinical information, improving caregiver communication, and reducing medical error. However, because of that increased accessibility of personal health information, it's at greater risk of being inappropriately used. As you guys have probably noticed, and as reported in the news over the years, various celebrities and dignitaries, from Britney Spears to Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, have had their personal health information breached. In these few instances, these inappropriate accesses were detected, but it's likely that many of these accesses go unnoticed. What's interesting about this environment is that hospital employees are typically not malicious. Rather, they're simply curious. As a health employee recently stated, it's pretty damn common for medical professionals to peek at files for unwarranted reasons. Moreover, a compliance officer who analyzes many of these breaches stated, most of the time, the motivation for snooping is curiosity or concern about a coworker, family member, or neighbor. However, as everyone I'm sure knows here, it's not legally allowed to look at a person's health information out of curiosity. Right? HIPAA, High-Tech Affordable Care Act, provide guidelines for the appropriate use of personal health information and potential fines and reporting requirements for those. So there's many challenges for securing electronic medical records. One of them is simply the complexity of the medical work environment, which we've heard of on this panel already. So you can imagine trying to secure electronic medical records with some type of fine-grained access control policy. A fine-grained access control policy simply works by specifying which patient's medical record each employee can access. However, the problem with this type of system is that they must be proactively specified. But as we all know, patient care is highly dynamic, and there's 42 different people or types of people accessing a patient's medical record every day. So it's really difficult to match the employee's data need to what actual data they will require. As a result, most hospitals currently choose, or many hospitals currently choose, an environment where once their employee has logged in and has been authenticated by the system, they can access any patient's medical record in the system. So at one large hospital, you may have 20,000 employees, 100,000, 200,000 patients. Any med student can access any patient's medical record. Any nurse, any lab assistant, and any receptionist can access any patient's medical record in many hospital systems. Even in an emergency situation, it's often irresponsible to prevent access, because then you potentially could cause harm to the patient by preventing the doctor from accessing the necessary medication orders or problem lists. Another large challenge in this space is simply the raw number of accesses that are occurring. At Michigan, we have millions of accesses occurring each week, and any type of manual analysis does not scale. So while we do deploy various strategies, such as monitoring accesses for VIPs or those who file complaints, for the general public, there's really not that much general monitoring going on. So one way you can think about improving the monitoring of electronic medical records is with what you could call traditional real-time auditing systems. These systems, as we've kind of heard before, provide a system that alerts some compliance officer when a suspicious access has occurred. And a suspicious access can be defined by various rules, as we've discussed, such as the employee has the same last name as the patient whose medical record they're accessing, or the employee and patient live in the same zip code, or are coworkers, or similarly, the employee is accessing too many records than expected for a given time. But this type of model opens up many interesting questions. If the number of alerts is small, a handful a day, 20, 30, maybe even 100 a day, the compliance officer can maybe potentially monitor those. But what happens if in a single day you have hundreds, if not thousands, of alerts? Do you have a fiduciary responsibility to follow up with each alert and track it? If this is the case, will you turn off your alerting system and no longer use it in the future? And also, what are the set of rules that you need to use in deploying your system so that it actually is capturing not just the same zip code or coworker, but are there more rules that you need to use for alerting? The other extreme of this, from this traditional sense, is more of a complaint-based system. Here, a patient files a complaint at various levels of specificity. One, they can say that they believe some employee, Alice, has accessed my medical record and knows my HIV status when they shouldn't. Or it can be a very, very general complaint. I believe someone in the hospital accessed my medical record after a car accident. And so these complaints can take a long time. Or even the implicit complaint when a VIP is treated at a hospital. So when these complaints are filed, the compliance office goes ahead and reviews those accesses. What they do typically is contact team leaders, contact the employee, read clinical notes, and to try to determine if each access that they're reviewing is appropriate or not. But as you can imagine, this is an extremely manual process and takes days, if not weeks, to complete. So what happens is there's a lot of wasted work. In general, hospital employees are very well behaved, but may have few instances of inappropriate behavior. So most of their accesses are appropriate. And specifically, most of their accesses are occurring for valid clinical and operational reasons to treat a patient. And these are not random one-off reasons that are occurring in the hospital, but they're the same reason occurring over and over, the same class of reasons occurring over and over for the entire hospital population. So this is actually kind of exemplified by the screensaver that's deployed in all machines at the University of Michigan Health System. It says authorized access is limited to those with need to know for purpose of patient care, billing, medical record review, and quality assurance. So the system that we're trying to build at Michigan, what we call the explanation-based auditing system, tries to take this observation and improve the efficiency of a complaint-based audit. That is, for each access that the compliance officer would normally have to review, it tries to determine the clinical or operational reason for access, the valid reason. And if a valid reason can be found, the access is marked as appropriate and does not need to be reviewed further by the compliance office. If no reason can be found, it's marked as suspicious and reviewed later. And the simple idea is that we want to filter these accesses so that the compliance officers have a much smaller subset of accesses to review. So what is the basic underlying premise here? There's many classes of valid reasons for access, and we can go and talk at a long length about what they are. But the main observation of the work we've been doing is that medical databases do a really good job documenting the process by which a patient is treated. It stores appointment information, medication orders, radiological findings, all of which can be used to infer who participated in the appointment, who administered the medication, who reviewed the x-ray. And that can be used to explain why an access has occurred. So we're using this more specifically, to give you an idea of what's happening under the hood. We're using this data to find connections between the patient and the employee accessing that patient's medical record. And we're using various data mining techniques to mine these connections in the medical database. And the idea is these connections are not one-off connections, but they're frequently occurring, and we can use common pattern mining techniques to find these frequently occurring connections. With these connections, we can express wide ranges of reasons for access, such as the doctor accessed the patient's medical record because of an appointment, or even the nurse accessed the patient's medical record because the nurse works with the doctor who has an appointment with the patient. So we're trying to use this to bridge the gap between complaint-based auditing and real-time auditing. So the weakness of complaint-based systems is that they're extremely manual and time-intensive, and that they typically only audit a few number of patients. At the other extreme, we have real-time auditing, which is automatic, but has the potential for a large alert avalanche that may want you to stop continuing monitoring the system. So if we can start to filter the number of accesses that compliance officers need to review, there's fewer questions for them to ask, and we can improve the overall efficiency of these complaint-based systems. Also, they still have the limited scope of a complaint-based system so that they can control what subset of accesses they look at rather than having to worry about potential warnings coming in. But this also has interesting applications for the proactive space. If you can reduce the time it takes to do a complaint-based audit, you can think about doing a complaint-based audit for a randomly selected set of patients every day. If we can get it down to a small number of minutes or hours to do an audit for each patient, you can select 10 a day and perform an audit for them and see if we can use that as a deterrent for other future inappropriate accesses in the hospital. And another thing you can do is combine these reasons for access, these clinical reasons for access, in combination with traditional types of real-time auditing to stop an alert when we can determine that it's actually occurring for a valid clinical or operational reason, so that we can try to bridge these two types of systems. So in summary, we're building this system, or we've built this system called the explanation-based auditing system at Michigan, which its main goal is to filter appropriate accesses that occur for valid clinical operational reasons, using various machine learning approaches that try to mine patterns and connections between hospital employees and patients. We're even using approaches to mine collaborative work environments where nurses and doctors work together. And so the aim is to reduce this gap between the current complaint-based system and the proactive type real-time auditing. And we're trying to deploy it at Michigan and evaluate if it has the efficiency gains that we really think it may have in the future. And going forward, we'll see what happens. So thank you.
All right. Well, with that, we'd like to open it up for some questions. If anybody has a question they'd like to ask the panel. Yes, ma'am.
Hello?
So it is a real technology that we sell. Adaptive Access Manager has been in the industry for, about maybe 10 years now. So it's a technology that we sell. What I don't like to say is that by purchasing the technology, you have the solution that we've talked about, that Jennings was talking about. The solution is something else. The solution is working with the individual hospital systems, typically a consulting partner, and understanding your auditing, your rules, your pattern analysis, and implementing that into the technology. So buying the technology alone and dropping it down would do you no good. There's a lot of work there. But I truly do believe that it will cut down on the total amount of time versus starting from scratch and having to build that system all yourself.
And Daniel, what's going to be the future for your research?
So actually, interesting plug for the National Science Foundation. They're sponsoring a program called the Innovation Corps, which takes research from universities and tries to see if it has a commercial impact. So right now I'm leading a National Science Foundation Innovation Corps team to see if we can actually go and take this research that was sponsored by the National Science Foundation in a university environment and convert it to an actual product that can be provided to hospitals.
So I have a question for Mike and Jennings, and that is one of the complaints I hear from the hospitals that we work with these tools when they implement them is even after they've got the tool and they've implemented it and they've got the system that's alerting them, et cetera. That's not the end of the job, as you alluded to, right? There's another piece to this. It's a process, and there's a people part of it, and somebody has to run those alerts down and make sure and determine whether or not they truly are a violation or whether or not it was a false positive. Which means an interface with the department heads, et cetera, in terms of the people who can actually determine whether or not there was an inappropriate access. And none of those other tools actually help automate that back-end process, which is one of the big workloads for folks because they don't have the resources to do that, let alone the notification and the alerting. So what does your solution do, or have you thought of that in terms of how you're going to help on the back end?
Well, first of all, we're hoping that what we've learned through our research can help us tune this to avoid false positives. That being said, I think when we do go live in a broad scale, we simply are actually going to staff up, if you will, to help with that, while hopefully there's that commensurate chilling effect that happens. I'm not sure there's a way around the impact. I mean, you're talking ultimately, when you implement tools like this and you really take this on head-on, about culture change. And culture change is difficult. It's difficult when people have worked in environments, like Daniel has said, where the record is open. That's really, I think, ultimately what we're willing to take on. I'm not sure there is a magic bullet, so to speak, that will take away from the heavy lifting. Those cases I mentioned around the false positives, around the nurse working on the case of the broken medical device, there's just no avoidance of that I can think of.
Okay.
If you want to comment.
Any other questions from the audience? There we go.
So there's been a lot of talk about the false positives. I'm actually interested to know if through any of these studies and efforts you've come up with any generalized statement that on average per 1,000 employees over the course of the year you're going to have 1 actual violation, 10 actual violations. Not the false positives, but the accurate positives.
So the false negatives, where we missed it, so to speak?
No, the actual rate that you would expect after having done this research and looked into it. If you made a prediction that next year, you have 20,000 employees, you could expect that you're going to have 10 of these incidents, or 20 or 30, or whatever the rate might be.
So I don't know if you can comment, Daniel, but our research probably wasn't a large enough sample to have a statistically valid statement along those lines. I don't know if you want to comment.
Yeah, we don't have the money to pay compliance officers to label 4 million accesses, and we go through one by one and say this one's appropriate or not. What I can say, what we're doing now is we have a list of a dozen or so inappropriate accesses, and what we're trying to do is go retrospectively look back and say, we know these were bad accesses. Can we use the technology to see if we can find them? And so I can't comment about the number of them because no one's spending the time looking through, and they're hard to find. It's a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, I think what they're all saying is that the data and the experience is too immature to really know what that answer is yet. I mean, when you look, like I said, when you look at the results from the audits last year where folks had fair warning, or they had IATRIC, or they had Luminet, or they had one of the other solutions out there, tools out there that they were using, when they actually looked at how much of the tool that they were actually using, they found that they were using less than 5% of its capability. And the reason they were using less than 5% of its capability in most cases, when they asked them what was the reason for that, was one of two things. Either when they turned it on and that bow wave hit the ship, management said turn it off, or when that bow wave hit the ship, compliance said turn it off because we can't handle it. We can't handle the workload that it's producing. So we're going to have to get to a point where with these solutions, whether it's the way that Jennings is approaching it, or whether you have one of those other solutions, if you will, we're going to have to get to the point where people actually have gotten over that bow wave and have actually gotten to a more normalized environment before we can actually answer questions like that with respect to, if you have 10,000 employees, how many violations can you expect in a given year? We'll get there, but we're not anywhere close to that yet. Kevin.
A couple questions from our tweeters. The first one's for Michael. Does Oracle have a list of integrated healthcare systems with their Adaptive Access Manager tool?
We do not. So we have a list of integration methods, which would be things such as being able to integrate via HL7 or SOA or flat file.
I was asking which customers.
Was it customers or vendors that we can connect to?
They only have 140 characters to specify, so I'm not sure.
Okay. So in terms of customers that we've worked within healthcare, in terms of something that's in place today, Partners is the premier customer we've worked with. We have a couple of other pilots that have taken place, but the solution's been used in a number of other industries, and we do have lists of those. And you could Google Adaptive Access Manager and get a lot of info.
Thanks. And then the second question, probably more for either Jennings or Mac. Can an employee look at their own record if policy allows it?
Well, what does Partners allow them to do?
We allow employees to look at their own record. I've worked at institutions which don't, where they've got to actually get approval. So it's varied in my professional career.
Yeah, it does vary. I mean, I would tell you that the overwhelming majority of the hospitals that we work with don't allow their employees to access their record directly. They have to request it just like any other patient would. But it's really up to the policy of the organization. Last question.
Hi. We know that a lot of people, the way we find out about a lot of these is people telling each other, right? So that's the reality. So I'm wondering, based on the cost of the products and the complexity of the organizations and our large kind of organizations, do you guys feel at the end of the day that this is reasonable and appropriate work to take on, or should we look elsewhere?
That's a good question. That is a good question. And I think the short answer is that if the cost of not doing it becomes sufficiently high enough, then the cost of doing it will become justified. Right now, we have an obligation to do it because we have a requirement to audit. And we can't audit manually anymore. We just have too much going on in our environments. You look at the average HIS system or EHR and the number of accesses that happen in a single encounter across a day, across a week, across a month, across a year. You can't manually audit that in a meaningful way. It's just, and that's what we've seen in all of the audits that we've done of organizations in the industry. When we look at what they've done, they're looking at a very, very small percentage of accesses in their organization. It's usually very reactive. It's usually things like just VIP employees or people with the same last name or looking at another employee, and you're not really doing meaningful auditing. You're not catching that admissions clerk who's actually stealing information and selling it for identity theft purposes, because you're not even looking at them because they don't fit any of those profiles. Until you start auditing the entire environment, you're not going to stop those kinds of incidents from occurring. And the question is OCR going to make it worthwhile for us to actually have to do it? If they start fining us for those kinds of things, and it starts costing us more in terms of breach cleanup or incident cleanup, then you'll see folks doing it.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting on the research side. You guys are already ahead of us to just sort of come up with some statements about what you think is reasonable and appropriate given costs and given the number of people, like the gentleman over here said, who'd we catch? We're not catching anybody doing this, then it's not really sort of, worth it. That's my thought.
Yeah, the problem is you can't really answer who did we catch because we're not really looking for them yet. Okay. Anyway, everybody thank the panel for their time. I think we're out of time. All right, David.